The voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent decades measuring twice before cutting once. "I have an appointment. The name is Emmett Lawson." The young woman at the reception desk of Ashford and Carver Legal Partners looked up briefly, then back down at her screen. She typed something, typed it again. Kelsey had been at the front desk for 8 months. She had learned, in those 8 months, which situations she was allowed to handle herself, and which ones she was supposed to refer upstairs. This, she decided in the space of about 4 seconds, was the second kind. She was already reaching for her phone when Brett Ogilvy appeared from the hallway behind her. Brett was 34 years old, recently made junior partner, and operating at a level of confidence that had never been tested by actual failure. He had grown up in a house where the right last name opened the right doors, and he had spent the last decade inside those doors without ever having to think about what it felt like to stand outside them. He took one look at the man standing at the reception desk and made a decision. The man was 68, though he looked ageless in the way that people who have done physical work their whole lives sometimes do. Not young, exactly, but solid, unhurried, built like someone who had been reliable for a very long time. He was wearing a green flannel shirt, soft from years of washing, tucked into work trousers that had been pressed carefully but still showed the creases of honest use. His boots were good boots, lace-up, the leather scuffed at the toes in the way that comes from kneeling on concrete. His hands, resting on the edge of the counter, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life building things. Around his left wrist, he wore a simple watch with a plain face and a worn leather band. Around his neck, tucked inside his collar, was a thin silver chain. Brett Ogilvy took all of this in, and he decided, wrong building. "Can I help you?" His voice carried easily across the marble lobby. Several people seated in the waiting area looked up from their phones. "I have an appointment," Emmett said again. 2 o'clock, I called ahead. The woman I spoke to said I was confirmed. "For what, exactly?" "Estate matter. My wife passed away 3 months ago. She held a trust through this firm. I'm here to discuss the administration." Brett's mouth curved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. He leaned one elbow on the counter beside Kelsey, as though he owned the space, which he acted like he did. "This is Ashford and Carver," he said slowly. "We handle complex estate and trust work, corporate clients, high net worth individuals." He let the phrase sit there for a moment, in case Emmett had missed the implication. "Do you have any paperwork with you? A file number? Anything from our office in writing?" Emmett reached into the worn canvas tote bag he was carrying, the kind sold at grocery stores for $1.99, and produced a manila folder, clean, organized, tabbed. "I have the original trust document, the death certificate, the letter your firm sent to my home 2 weeks ago, seen confirming this appointment, and the contact information for the associate who handled my wife's account. I can show you any of those." Brett didn't touch the folder. "What was your wife's name?" "Marion Lawson." Brett glanced at Kelsey. Kelsey had the Marion Lawson file open on her screen. She had opened it the moment Emmett had said his name. She could see the estate value in the summary field. She had been staring at it for 45 seconds and had not yet said a single word, because Brett Ogilvy was standing 2 feet from her, and Kelsey had learned in 8 months what happened to people who interrupted Brett Ogilvy. "I'm not finding anything," Brett said, though he had not looked at Kelsey's screen. He had not looked at any screen. He had looked for the duration of this conversation only at Emmett Lawson and at the green flannel shirt and at the grocery store tote bag. "I think there may have been a mix-up. Probably a different firm." "There's no mix-up." Emmett's voice was the same as it had been at the start. Low, patient, not raised. "I have the letter right here." "Sir." Brett straightened. He was enjoying himself in the particular way that certain people enjoy having power over a situation. "I've been with this firm for 6 years. I know every file we carry. If there were a Marion Lawson estate of any significance, I would know about it." He paused. "Perhaps your wife was a client of one of the smaller firms downtown, someone who handles." Another pause, another look at the flannel shirt, simpler matters. 2 of the waiting area clients had stopped looking at their phones entirely. A paralegal named Bertrand Howe, who was crossing through the lobby with a stack of files, slowed his pace without stopping. He had heard Brett use that tone before. He knew what it meant. He kept walking because he had learned the hard way that stopping cost you something. A woman named Fiona Ames, seated at a corner desk sorting correspondence, had gone very still. She had worked for Quentin Carver for 19 years. She had been the one 3 months ago to handle Marion Lawson's file when the death notification came in. She had been the one 2 weeks ago to mail the appointment confirmation to the address in Kelowna. She knew exactly who Emmett Lawson was. She did not stand up, not yet. She was watching to see if Brett would stop on his own. He didn't. "I'd like you to take your folder and go," Brett said. "If you believe there's been an error, you can call our intake line. Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. He gestured toward the door. Emmett looked at him for a moment. "I'm not leaving," he said. It was said quietly, without heat or performance. It was simply a fact, stated the way a man who has been saying true things his whole life states a fact. Brett's expression shifted. The performance was over. What was underneath it was less polished. "Excuse me. I'm not leaving. My wife spent 30 years building something, and she trusted this firm to look after it. I drove 4 hours to be here today. I have an appointment. You haven't pulled up a single file. You haven't asked for ID. You decided the moment I walked in that I didn't belong here, and you're wrong." He picked up his folder from the counter and held it. "Pull up the file, or get someone who will." The lobby had gone quiet in that particular way. Not absence of sound, but the held breath of people who have stopped pretending to do something else. Brett's jaw tightened. He turned to the security guard. By the door, a broad-shouldered man named Dale, who had worked the front of the building for 11 years and was already on his way over. Moving more out of habit than certainty, because something about the old man in the flannel shirt had made Dale's instincts hesitate. "Dale," Brett said, "I'm going to need you to escort this gentleman." "Mr. Ogilvy." The voice came from across the lobby. Fiona Ames had stood up. She was 52 years old, compact and sharp-eyed, and she had the particular stillness someone who had decided to do something and was not going to be talked out of it. "Mr. Ogilvy, this gentleman has a confirmed appointment. I made the booking myself. The file number is LT0084 Lawson. The client is Emmett Lawson, spouse of the late Marion Lawson, who held a revocable living trust with this firm since 2009. She paused. "I've already texted Mr. Carver." The lobby took a breath. Brett turned. "Fiona." "He's on his way down." Dale stopped walking. He stood very still by the column, looking at the middle distance. Brett turned back to Emmett. His confidence was not entirely gone. It had simply gone quiet, looking for another angle. "Well," he said after a moment that was too long, "I'm sure there's been a miscommunication somewhere, if the file exists." "It exists," Fiona said. She did not look at Brett when she said it. She was looking at Emmett Lawson, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who was deeply sorry they had waited as long as they had. The elevator at the far end of the lobby opened. Quentin Carver walked out. He was 71, tall and slightly stooped in the way of men who have spent years leaning over desks with close-cropped white hair and glasses on a chain around his neck. He was wearing a dark gray suit that had seen better years but fit him well, the suit of a man who had never cared much about suits. He walked at the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere to be except exactly where he was going. He crossed the lobby without looking at Brett. He did not look at the waiting clients or the tellers or the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling. He walked past the reception desk and stopped in front of Emmett Lawson. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Quentin's eyes moved over the flannel shirt, the calloused hands, the worn watch, the silver chain, and then his face did something complicated. Recognition and grief and something older than both of those things combined. "Emmett," he said. "Quentin." Emmett's voice was the same, unhurried. "You've got a bit of gray in." "So do you." Quentin put out his hand. Emmett took it. The handshake lasted a moment longer than handshakes usually do. "I'm sorry I wasn't down here myself. Fiona told me what happened in the lobby." He paused. "I'm sorry it happened in my building." "It's all right." "It isn't." Quentin said it without looking away from Emmett's face. Then he turned. Brett Ogilvy was still standing by the reception desk. He had not moved. He had the look of a man watching something happen that he could not locate in any of his previous experience. "Brett," Quentin said, "come to the desk, please." Brett came. "Sit down." Brett sat. "Pull up the Lawson estate file number LT0084. Brett's hands moved over the keyboard. He typed the number. The file opened. It had been sitting in the system for 15 years, tagged, organized, fully documented. The kind of file that Fiona Ames maintained with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understood that paper is how the living speak for the dead. "Read me the estimated estate value," Quentin said. His voice was conversational. "Out loud." Brett's eyes moved to the screen. Something changed in his face, a series of small changes, like a lock clicking through its tumblers. "Mr. Carver." "The figure, Brett, please." Brett read it. His voice came out as something between a statement and a question. $3.4 million. The waiting area was very still. One of the clients, a woman in a tailored blazer who had been watching since Emmett first walked in, set her phone face down on her knee and left it there. Emmett did not react to the number. He had known the number for 3 months. Marion had told him everything in the last weeks, the way people tell you everything when there is no longer any reason to wait. There's more than you think, Em. I sold things quietly. Don't be angry. I wanted there to be enough. I wanted it to matter. He had not been angry. He had held her hand and told her it mattered. He had told her it would always matter. Quentin looked at Brett for a long time without speaking. You didn't pull up the file, he said finally. When Mr. Lawson told you his wife's name and his appointment and the nature of his business here, you didn't look at a single record. Brett started to say something. Quentin raised one hand slightly, and Brett stopped. You decided, based on what he was wearing, that he wasn't someone you needed to take seriously. He paused. In front of a lobby full of clients, in front of my staff, in front of a man who drove 4 hours this morning to honor his wife's wishes. Another pause. That is not a small error, Brett. That is a failure of the most basic professional and human obligation of this job. He turned away from Brett and looked at the lobby, at the waiting clients, at Kelsey behind the desk, at Dale by the column. Fiona, he said, would you please show Mr. Lawson up to my office? The good chairs, and there's coffee if he'd like it. Of course, Mr. Carver. Quentin looked back at Brett. Stay here. Patricia from HR will be with you shortly. He crossed the lobby again, at the same unhurried pace, and fell into step beside Emmett Lawson. They walked together toward the elevator. The painting, Quentin said quietly as the doors opened. The one Marion did of the lake, she sent me a photograph of it maybe 10 years ago. I've thought about it often. It's at the National Gallery now, Emmett said. They came to the house for it, 2 years back, Marion cried. She didn't think I saw, but I did. Quentin smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that takes up the whole face. She was remarkable, he said. She was, Emmett said. She was the best thing I ever did. The elevator doors closed behind them. In the lobby, the waiting clients began quietly to breathe again. Dale returned to his post by the door. He did not look at Brett. He looked at the middle distance and thought about the old man in the flannel shirt who had not raised his voice once, not when he was being talked down to, not when he was being gestured toward the door, not when Brett had implied, clearly, that his wife's life had been a simple matter. Dale had been in this building for 11 years. He had watched a lot of things he had not said anything about. He was still thinking about that when the HR officer arrived. Patricia Bro was the firm's director of human resources, a careful and methodical woman in her late 50s who had heard a summary of events from Fiona Ames on the way down and had not needed more than that. She sat across from Brett Ogilvy in the small meeting room off the main hallway, a legal pad open in front of her, and she began at the beginning. Walk me through your reasoning, she said, when Mr. Lawson first approached the desk. Brett walked her through it. The explanation took longer than the original event and was less coherent. The longer he talked, the more clearly visible the gap became between the story he was telling and the simple fact of what he had done. Patricia did not interrupt. She let him finish. You made a determination about the nature of his business, she said, before you had looked at any documentation, confirmed any appointment, or asked for identification. I was trying to protect the firm's. You were trying to protect the lobby's impression, Patricia said in the same even tone. Those are different things. Brett said nothing. The firm's obligation to its clients is the same regardless of what they're wearing when they walk in. That obligation doesn't scale with the cost of their shoes. It doesn't adjust based on whether they're carrying a leather briefcase or a grocery bag. She closed the pad. Mr. Carver has asked me to conduct a full review. That review will include the lobby footage, your file access history for this afternoon, and statements from the staff who were present. I've been with the firm for 6 years, Brett said. Patricia looked at him steadily. Yes, she said, that's part of what we'll be reviewing. Kelsey gave her statement in 12 minutes. She was honest, in the way that people are honest when they have been frightened into silence long enough, and the silence has finally stopped feeling like safety. She said she had seen the file. She said she had known the appointment was real, she said. She had not spoken up because Brett had been standing 2 feet away, and because she had watched what happened to people who interrupted Brett Ogilvy. And because she had been afraid. Patricia listened to all of it. You're not being terminated, she told Kelsey when it was done. But I want you to understand something. Your silence was not neutral. A man drove 4 hours to keep faith with his wife's memory, and for a few minutes, he stood in this lobby and was told by implication that neither of them mattered. You could have prevented that. And you didn't. Because you were afraid. She paused. Fear is real. I understand fear. But I want you to sit with that and decide what you'll do next time. Because there will be a next time, in one form or another, and by then I'd like you to be ready. Kelsey nodded. Her eyes were bright. She would not forget it. Years later, when she was coordinating intake for the firm's pro bono program, she would say that afternoon was the day she understood that staying quiet had a cost, and it was always paid by someone else. Bertrand Howe was the last person Patricia spoke to, and she had specifically requested him. He sat across from her with his hands folded and told her carefully and completely about 3 years of incidents. He had dates for most of them. He had written some down in a notebook at home because he had understood that writing things down mattered even when no one was asking to read them yet. He filled 11 pages of Patricia's legal pad. When he was done, she put her pen down. You filed a complaint, she said, 14 months ago. Yes. You were told to recalibrate your perspective. Yes. I'm sorry, Patricia said. That was wrong. Your complaint was valid and you should have been heard and you weren't. And that's a failure I'm going to address directly. She looked at him. Are you willing to have your account entered formally into the review? Yes, Bertrand said. He said it without hesitating, which was new. 3 years of carrying it quietly had made the word feel large. Saying it out loud made it smaller. Patricia closed the pad. Thank you for staying. Bertrand thought about that on the elevator ride back to his floor. He had stayed because he needed the job, mostly. But he had also stayed because somewhere underneath the exhaustion of watching and saying nothing, he had to believe, that eventually someone would ask. Someone had asked. Upstairs, in Quentin Carver's corner office, Emmett Lawson was sitting in a leather armchair with a mug of coffee and looking at the painting on the wall behind the desk. It was a small watercolor. A marsh in late October, the grass has gone to gold, a strip of pewter sky at the top. The signature in the lower right corner was small and careful. M. Lawson. She sent it 20 years ago, Quentin said, following his gaze, after I made partner. Said she wanted the office to have something true in it. Emmett was quiet for a moment. That sounds like her. They talked for a long time. Not about the trust, not yet. That would come later properly with the documents and the timelines and the careful work that Quentin had been waiting to begin. They talked about Marion, about the lake house in Kelowna, about the years in between. Quentin had tried, more than once over those years, to put into words what that moment had meant. 44 years ago, when Emmett Lawson, who was 24 and working 2 jobs to support his mother, had pressed an envelope into Quentin's hand outside the law school registrar's office. Not a loan, a gift, no conditions, no ceremony. Just the one quiet sentence. Go become something worth being. You never let me repay it, Quentin said. No. I've thought about it for 44 years. Emmett looked at him with the patient, slightly amused expression of a man who has had this conversation several times and still finds it unnecessary. You built something, he said. That was the point. You built something, too. Different kind of building. Emmett set down his mug. Marion built this. I just kept the house warm while she did. Quentin shook his head slowly, but did not argue. Brett Ogilvy resigned before the review was formally concluded. He submitted his letter on a Friday and was gone by Monday. Patricia Gabbro's report noted 7 documented incidents over 3 years, any one of which would have warranted termination for cause. It also noted the failed internal complaint of 14 months prior and recommended a full review of the firm's internal reporting structure. Quentin signed off on every recommendation Patricia made. He also did one thing the report hadn't asked for. He called Bertrand Howe into his office, offered him a chair, and spent 40 minutes asking about his work. 3 months later, Bertrand was leading the firm's newly established Client Services Review Committee. He was, by general agreement, very good at it. 2 years passed, the way years do when they contain enough small and necessary things. The Marion Lawson estate was administered carefully and completely, in exactly the way Marion had intended. A portion of it established a small arts grant, awarded annually to emerging landscape painters in British Columbia who were working without institutional support. The grant was administered by a committee that Emmett chaired, mildly and without fanfare, in the way he had always done things. The application materials carried, on their cover page, a reproduction of a watercolor of a marsh in late October, a painting that had hung for 30 years above a workbench in a garage in Kelowna before a gallery director happened to see it, and had hung for 2 more in the National Gallery of Canada before Marion Lawson had thought to mention to her husband where it had gone. Emmett attended the grant notification ceremonies. He sat in the back and let other people do the talking. He brought coffee in the thermos. Marion had given him the winter before she got sick. He still wore the green flannel shirt sometimes. Marion had teased him about it for 3 decades. He wore the silver chain every day. He wore the silver chain every day. Since the morning she could no longer fasten it herself. When her hands had grown too unsteady, and he had done the clasp for her at the back of her neck and kissed the top of her head and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the morning didn't already know. On a Tuesday in April, 3 years after Marion's passing, a young woman in paint-stained jeans and a down vest walked into the offices of Ashford and Carver Legal Partners. She was 23, carrying a portfolio under one arm and a letter in her hand confirming her as one of that year's Marion Lawson Arts Foundation recipients. The letter said she could come in any morning before noon to sign the paperwork. She stood at the reception desk and said, a little nervously, "Hi, I have an appointment. I'm not sure I'm in the right place." Kelsey looked up and smiled. "You're in exactly the right place," she said. "Can I get you a coffee while you wait?" The young woman sat in one of the chairs by the window. She held the letter in both hands and looked at the reproduction on the cover page, the marsh, the gold grasses, the pewter sky, and she did not know the name of the man who had driven 4 hours on a gray morning to stand quietly at a reception desk and refuse to be turned away. She did not need to know it. She only knew that someone had believed a painter's work was worth protecting, that someone had made sure it lasted, and that the world she had been handed, difficult and full of people who would look at her paint-stained jeans and make a quick decision, also contained people who showed up and held the door and kept faith with something true. She looked at the painting on the letter. She thought, I want to make something like that. She would.